So, Chris, let's take 10 and talk about the housing market.
Nuts.
I was trying to come up with a word to describe it. Yeah, crazy, bonkers. Well, we'll go with irrational, perhaps.
I mean, it's just one of those things where you're seeing houses for sale at prices that make no sense, right?
A house 4 doors down from me that hasn't been touched in terms of any renovations for the last 40 years went on the market 2 weeks ago, is in escrow as of a week ago, I would assume at full ask, and it's 35% over what I paid for my house in
Probably already
2019.
sold.
It's crazy.
COVID's had a lot to do, I think, with the housing market kind of just skyrocketing. And it's not just here in Southern California, it's happening all across the country. And it's specifically kind of those middle market cities, right? Where you've had a lot of people leave these big metropolitan areas. So, I mean, Manhattan's the one that jumps out to me kind of first, but people leaving the big city, moving to areas where there's still a lot of jobs, but there's more space to breathe. The cost of houses is much more affordable. There's a lot of outdoor living space and just areas of the country. I mean, I was reading the Journal the other day. They pulled out a couple of cities, but Greenville, South Carolina was an example that they threw out. And it's because you've got a great diversification of demand drivers for jobs. There's a lot of high tech there. There's a lot of manufacturing there. So you got the new and the old. Mm-hmm. Tons of outdoor parks and just places where people can go on walks and enjoy outdoor living. It's just it's a very interesting thing that's taking place right now, where people are moving to these cities.
Yeah, well, so you've got a transition of people in terms of where they want to live, and the other side of the coin is that you've got very, very limited supply.
Oh yeah, typically supply runs 4 or 5 months. Mm-hmm. Supply right now is only 2.1 months. And to put that in context, like the record low supply is 2 months of supply. So we're right down there at the bottom as far as, what's available. So people moving around, but there's not necessarily anywhere to move to, right? So they're having to bid up these places. And then the other thing is construction wise, I mean, construction is down. We're not building enough homes to keep up with the demand.
And this isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. This has been a bear market in housing construction, essentially since the great financial crisis. If you go back to 2009, I think housing starts dipped to something like less than 500,000. Now, if you go back historically to 1959 to 2021, the average is 1.4 million. But you have to put that number in context because our population has been growing over that period of time as well. So since 2009, we've been running at roughly 1 million new. So put that again, compare that to 1.4 million is just the average, but we need a whole heck of a lot more than what we have. So, what has been the, impediment for new construction?
Have you tried to go buy a piece of wood at Home Depot lately?
I spend a lot of time at Home Depot, actually, and unfortunately, lumber is not something that I've been buying because it's ridiculous. A sheet of plywood pre-pandemic was maybe $10, $12, and we're talking about $55 to $65. Not a great time to be re-roofing my house, unfortunately.
Well, I think too, when you think about the pandemic and kind of the halt that it caused, right? Pandemic hits in March of 2020, which is kind of going right into the spring selling season. So a lot of homeowners hit the pause button as far as like, I'm not going to try to sell my house during a pandemic. And we haven't really seen that get turned back on quite yet. You also saw a halt in construction, right? Everything was taking longer. Supply chain breakdowns, all of these different things kind of clogged up that whole industry. And so it's going to take a little while for that to sort itself back out as we turn the corner on COVID. But in the meantime, it's like, where's the end? Are housing prices just going to continue to skyrocket? Are we going to see them pull back? I think one of the big things there that has played probably the biggest factor out of everything is the cost to borrow is still so cheap. You can go out and get a 30-year mortgage right now at sub 3%. I mean, that's almost free money. And so until we see borrowing costs start to tick up, I mean, the reason why things are going over market, if I have to pay an additional $50,000 on a property, but I'm amortizing that over 30 years, I mean, it's less than $200 a month at the end of the day that I'm having to spend to get that house that I really want to get.
Well, and you think about So pandemic happens. It put everyone's world on its side. But when you really get down to it, there's 8 million jobs that still haven't come back. A lot of the jobs, though, for the home buying population, those that have the means, have money saved up, and so on and so forth, they actually weren't impacted. In fact, they potentially were recipients of some of those stimulus monies, and yet they didn't suffer any of the financial hardship that a lot of people unfortunately did throughout this. So you have consumers sitting in a better position arguably than they were a year ago. You've got interest rates that are lower than they've been really in any time historically. That is basically fueling this drive for people to want to expand, have a larger footprint, have their neighbor not necessarily hovering over their back, right?
Sure, sure. Okay, so outlook going forward then. What are the things that could derail the housing market? For me, it's borrowing costs going up and then a ton of construction. I mean, I think those are probably the two biggest issues that we need to be wary of. Doesn't look like either of those is happening though anytime soon.
I mean, construction is obviously being hampered by what's going on in the lumber space. Right now, it's really, really bizarre. You have a whole host of factors that actually lead back to the great financial crisis. You had a booming industry where lumber was being gobbled up, and then the GFC basically stopped that. And as an operator of a sawmill, which are very, very expensive to build, so it's not like you can just put one in and get that thing up and running right away. And so we saw a lot of those actually close down and they were curtailed. Additionally, where is the raw lumber coming from? On the West Coast, a lot of it is coming from Canada. Well, the current administration has decided to double the tariffs on lumber that we're importing. So making it more expensive, let alone the fact that in Canada, they're dealing with wildfires and they're also dealing with beetles basically that are destroying what could be viable lumber shipped down to our sawmills. So lots of problems, making it more expensive to construct. So that'll likely push the hurdle out a little bit farther. Financing, we don't necessarily see interest rates climbing, but let's talk about the quality of the loans that are being made today, because that was obviously a huge issue looking back to the great financial crisis.
Well, right. 08, you could, what was it? You fog a mirror and you can
The
get a loan.
ninja loans.
Yeah.
No income, no job, no assets.
So it's different today. I mean, it's still pretty hard to get a loan for most people, although that's actually starting to loosen up a little bit. It's actually getting a little bit easier. So it's actually the opposite direction. If it was harder to get a loan, you might see the housing market slow down a bit. But if they start to make it easier, I mean, how long can this thing go?
Well, again, keeping another eye on Washington, one of the things that's been proposed by the current administration is eliminating what could be up to $50,000 worth of student debt. The goal is to help drive higher rates of home ownership. And so if something like that happens, your debt to income ratio is going to decrease, making you a more viable borrower without having to stretch or expand the borrower base that you're actually considering.
If I'm not spending $500 a month on my student loan, I have that $500 now to go spend on, a single family home. Very interesting what's happening in the housing space. Doesn't look like it's going to slow down. I think the takeaway is there's definitely certain markets too that are going to fare better than others. These middle market, kind of more space, more affordable. Those look to be good areas where I think we're going to continue to see lots of growth. The big cities, they're in a tough spot right now. But at some point, people will be moving back to New York.
Yeah, and I'll leave you with this. I know that there are a lot of folks that are in our sort of age demographic and a little bit younger that sort of felt like they missed the opportunity to get, a toehold on the housing ladder. And they've been waiting and waiting and waiting for housing to stumble and to crash. I hear that all the time. I'm waiting for the next crash so I can buy. I don't think we're going to be looking at a situation where when this thing finally does slow down, we're not going to see a massive correction like we did in 2008 because we have a stronger foundation underneath it.
Right.
And so if you are one of those folks at home that's waiting, you might be waiting for a very, very, very long time to the point where you're going to be a renter for life if that's the case.
Yeah. Well, interesting. We'll see what happens. Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.